The Christian Association for Survivors of Suicide Loss is pleased to present our podcast, Reaching for Hope with Joy Osborne. Let's join Joy and her guests as they discuss topics of relevance for emotional and spiritual wellness.
Welcome, listeners, to our podcast this month. I have a really good friend with me today, Marcy Renee, and I wanted to share a little bit about Marcy before we get started talking about grief. Marcy, along with her French husband and 4 boys, is a global nomad who has traveled to more than 30 countries and has lived in the United States, France, Morocco, and Spain. Marcy is a certified English and French teacher, life coach, public speaker, and trauma debriefer who is trained in narrative therapy. She currently lives in Spain and works with women who are rescued survivors of human trafficking. She is the published author of 7 children's picture books and 5 created nonfiction books. And we're going to have a link on our site so you can get to these or look up these books. I really encourage everybody to go out there and take a look at them and purchase them. And I know you'll be changed and ministered through them. Today we want to talk about one of her books, which I think is amazing. It's My Tower is Tumbling. And so, Marcy, I wanted to thank you actually for coming today or being available today to talk to us about this and your experiences in writing the book and your future adventures. So thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Joy. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, and I wanted to first start out with maybe sharing a little bit about the book and what inspired you to write this book.
Okay, so My Tower is Tumbling is based on a true story. I have 4 of my own boys. They range in ages from 26 to 11. So we've got a crazy gap.
Yeah.
And just as I walked through my own children's stories, obviously as their mother living life alongside them, I saw my own children go through a lot of grief and pain in their own life journeys. And oftentimes I felt hopeless. I felt like I didn't have the tools. Sometimes it was a shared family grief story, and sometimes I didn't know how to process my own grief, let alone know how to help my children process theirs. So as I watched my children grow up through the years, I realized that they were carrying a lot of pain and grief that was unprocessed. And it actually was a few years ago, my 3rd son, he had been at a youth conference, and he came back with a book by Lauren Wells, who is a researcher and author. She has her own organization called TCK Training. And TCK is Third Culture Kids, for some of you out there who might not know that term, which is, the way we can define it is it's a child who is born in a country that's not his passport country. So maybe someone who's been working as with a family who's a military family, or maybe a missionary family, or whatever would take them to another country. They're raised in a language and culture that is not of their own passport country. So my son came home with this book by Lauren Wells, and it was called Unstacking Your Grief Tower for Adult TCK, so Adult Third Culture Kids. And I read it. And when I read this book, I began weeping, Joy, because I was reading and hearing my own children's stories, especially my adult children, and realizing that they had so much accumulated grief and loss in their own lives and that had not been processed simply because they didn't know how. I didn't know how to help them. Yeah. And so I thought, wow, what if there could be a children's book? Like it literally was inspired by me wanting a book that I didn't have when I needed it, when my kids were growing up. And I thought, wow, could I somehow put this concept of the grief tower into a conversation, kid-friendly, age-appropriate story where parents and caregivers, teachers can begin that conversation to help their children start processing their grief at a young age, so that they don't have to grow up with this accumulated grief tower. So that's kind of what inspired it, and it's Pierre's journey of accumulating a lot of hard stories, good stories too, because our lives are full of good stories. Yes. But when he experienced the hard things, he began accumulating rocks, and eventually his tower tumbled, and he needed his parents and the support of his parents and God as well to help him process that and to heal from it. So that's kind of the story. I don't want to tell too much
Yeah, I know.
of the book, but just to give you a little taste. So it was very much based on Lauren Wells, who inspired it, but my own kids' journeys as well of grief and pain.
That's good. Now, when you mentioned grief, explain a little bit more about, are you talking they lost a lot of family and friends to passing away, or help me understand and help our listeners understand what you mean by grief?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Joy. I think when we hear the word grief, I don't know about you, but for me, my mind immediately goes to the loss of a loved one. It goes to someone who has died, the passing of someone. Whereas when we think about grief, grief is going to represent any loss in our life. So when I first started writing this book, my mind was definitely geared towards my own children and thinking about their journeys. They obviously, having grown up in multiple, countries and continents, they had a lot of loss of things that were familiar, their own language, their own culture. They had to leave grandparents and friends on the other side of the world. They were sometimes uprooted overnight, and they had to literally leave their home, anything that was of security and comfort for them. They had to leave their schools. They had to leave pets behind. They've lost pets. So I think grief is much larger than that. And if we think, even reflect on our own lives as adults, right? We can think about, we could count the losses that we've had in our own lives. And yes, those do include losing loved ones throughout our lifetime, but it also includes so many losses of friendship and homes, all those changes that we go through that begin to accumulate.
Right. And, I know for me, just moving from one state to another, it's very traumatic. But to go to another country, I can only imagine, the cultures are different, the food is different, the people are different. So I think this is very great topic, because I can only imagine how many people are actually going through grief and not knowing how to process that. So I'm grateful that you have written this geared towards children. And remind me again, what age groups is this targeting?
For me, children's books are from 0 to 99. Like, I love children's books. Take me to a library or bookstore, and I'm right in the children's book section always. I just think there are such life lessons in children's stories. But yes, ideally, kind of the 3 to 12 age range. I know that sounds like a really large age, but it can be adapted because, I've included a lot of different resources and things like that, so you can adapt it also for the age of the child. But it's amazing because getting so much feedback through people who have used the book, parents are saying, I'm processing my own grief through this book, and as I'm talking to my children, and we're using it as a family. So I think the target audience has expanded to a lot of families and then, spaces like that where these conversations can get started around a kitchen table or that kind of thing. But, originally kind of going back to this idea of what is grief, I think we're realizing that grief it's a universal story, right? Everyone, at every age and anywhere in the world is touched by grief and loss in some way or another. And I was sharing a little bit about my own kids' journeys and their, the moves just, through their transitions around the world. And so when I first wrote that book, that's what I was thinking about. I was thinking about those kids. And then I walked into a children's bookstore, I'll never forget it, in Pennsylvania, and I presented my book to the bookstore owner. He'd been there for decades. And he said, I am so glad to see a children's book for, on grief and loss, because he said, we have families walk in and they're looking for those resources and they don't have them. And I thought, wow, yes, because grief does hit the whole world and we need to talk about it. So originally, again, thinking about my own kids, but I hope that this can be a book that can help families, children, and adults alike around the world, whatever their context and situation is.
That's great. That's great because, growing up in my generation and maybe yours, it was not a topic you talked about, or a lot of families didn't really get into how you're feeling and how you're processing. And I think bringing awareness to that, being able to have conversation with your children, because a lot of times I've read, and maybe you know this as well because you've developed a lot of books for children that, a lot of them internalize a lot and they don't know how to process that. And so they keep it in. And that's why your book is very, very good about addressing that and being able to give an example of how to handle that. So I think that's great. And the more we can get communicating, the more we can have opportunities to open up in a safe space, right? To be able to, the people you're sharing it with, that is great. Because as you know, with our organization that we have, we don't want to see people, lost, to get hopeless, getting in that place where they don't see hope. And so this to me is really good resource to our book, and resources, like you said at the end, I want to talk about that in a few minutes, but having something there for parents, like you said, some have already given you feedback. I think that's wonderful. And so many more listeners of ours and then their friends as well, I hope will read this and, implement it, use it to bring conversation to areas that we in the past were told, we don't need to be talking about or didn't know how to talk about or process. So I think that is wonderful.
And you're so right, Joy. I just wanted to say, you mentioned we internalize it and we don't know how to talk about it. Adults as well, right?
Right.
Children. And I think you're right, like having a story, a children's story where there's a character, right? Pierre, even though this is based on a true life, real experience. Oh. Pierre, represents my four boys. So he's very real and relatable, I hope, to other children. But sometimes hearing a story about someone else, right? Not yourself, it can invite reflection and it can invite that conversation. And I always say to parents who maybe kids are a little less verbally expressive or with emotions and so forth, talking about as they're reading the story, as parents can talk about their own griefs and losses with their children and kind of model talking about it, processing it, can often invite, the children to start externalizing that in the way of verbalizing it and processing it to heal. So.
That's good. That's really good. The more, like I said, the more we can do that, I think the better we will be, and it becomes a norm instead of an exception. Like when we're really bad, why not, even before we get in that space, to be able to talk through things as well. I think that's wonderful. Obviously, your faith is very important to you, and I know part of this does bring up faith. So is there anything, a Bible verse or something that goes alongside this that may come to mind when you were writing it?
Well, I've always, as a writer and as an author, I've always loved, it's Hebrews 12:2, where it talks about Jesus. God is the author and perfecter of our faith. And so I've always said he's the author and finisher of our faith story. He's at the beginning, he's at the middle, especially the messy middle when things are hard and we don't understand and they look awful and they don't feel good. And he's also the author of the end of our story. And so as we look at our whole life story and the good and the hard parts, and there are some chapters in our lives that we wish, were never written, but we know that God does use those and he redeems those. Right. So that's one that I've always held on to, and especially in this book where it talks about kind of the accumulation of these rocks or these stories, the hard ones and the good ones in our lives. As Pierre is processing each rock and each story and remembering and healing from that story through prayer and with the support of his family and his parents. It's this idea that, God holds our story. Our story is sacred because he is the author and the finisher of our faith story, and he's in it with us from the beginning to the end. So that's one I always hold on to in this book in particular, but also in all of my writing. I just hold on to that a lot. And thinking of Bible verses, another one that comes to mind for this particular book, in Matthew 11:28, when Jesus said, "Come to me, all of you who are heavy laden and burdened." Yeah. And as you read the book, Pierre, it's just like all of us when we're carrying the grief and the losses in our lives. It's like these rocks, this tower that is gradually accumulating until at some point we can't carry it. We can't hold it. It's too heavy to carry. And in Pierre's situation, and what happens a lot of times is that, the tower the accumulated losses and grief gets so big that it just crashes down, right? And then we're just left kind of in the rubble of the life and the rubble of our stories, and we have to process it. We have to begin to look at it. But if we, thinking about this verse of Jesus saying, come to me, you're heavy and laden, you're burdened with all of these rocks, all of these heavy griefs and losses. And if we would come to him, and that's what I hope the book can allow too, to just begin coming rock by rock or story by story as they come into our lives and process them with the Lord in a healthy, healing way, that they won't accumulate. Because, Joy, I know in your work in, suicide prevention, I was just baffled when I read Lauren Wells' research on kind of this unprocessed grief, these towers that accumulate of loss and grief starting at a very young age. Yeah. And they're seeing that kind of in that 18 to 25 year range, often there's just an incident. It doesn't even have to be a huge, massive, stressful incident, but there's something that happens in young adults' lives that's just enough to kind of tip the tower over, if that makes sense.
Yes.
And it just comes crashing down. And if there isn't that support of a healthy family environment, home environment, parents who are there supportive to be there when the tower crashes, if there's not that element of faith of being, bringing God in to carry the burden to help us heal from that, it does make me wonder, is that part, is it the accumulated, unprocessed grief and loss that could be attributing even to some of the rise of suicide rates and things that we're seeing in our society?
Yeah. Yeah. And, a lot of what, we share in the groups and some of the research that we've done, where people get to that place of, like I was saying earlier, of they feel like they have no hope. And because also what was mentioned earlier as well is that many times we don't know how to deal with life. Some are ashamed, some are thinking, well, maybe there's something wrong with me. Some are like, I see this only option instead of having that openness with other people. And what I like is, I think you even said that, having that opportunity to talk, even at the home. I think a lot of it starts at home, doesn't it? Where we have healthy relationships. And also there's churches, there's people that are there to help, there's counselors, but yet a lot of this society was brought up, like myself, that, getting help is a sign of weakness, which we know is not true. We know the enemy doesn't want us to get healthy, and we sometimes think we have to overcome and be strong in ourselves. We are strong to a point, but God has also given us people to go to help us with these stresses in our lives. And sometimes people don't even realize that is a stress that's causing them to act a certain way or feel a certain way. So yeah, definitely having that communication, I think, is very important. Being open to, realize that getting help is okay. And helping others is just amazing. I love being able to help others as well, but also having people in my life that help. And yes, we have the Bible, we have God, we have that relationship with the Lord. And God has also brought us other people that, to help us alongside one another through our trials and through our situations. So if anybody's listening today that is going through some really difficult times, young or old, I pray that God would just, reveal himself to you. I pray that you would reach out to other people, because it's okay not to be okay, as long as we're getting some help for those moments of those stressful times that we're in right now. Don't let pride stand in the way. There's a lot of people out there that want to help you, that are there for you. So, reach out to your church, Christian counselor, reading the Bible, praying, whatever it is that you need. We want you to be safe. We want you to know that you're important, that God still has a plan for your life. And that's what I love about back to your book, Marcy, that, processing as a child, being able to trust the parents and those, maybe even others in their life, to be able to express themselves in a safe way, that they're not going to be condemned, they're not going to be looked down on, that it's a really healthy conversation for something that's very important. And sometimes kids don't think they can do that and be able to share how they're feeling, but I pray that they open up and realize that, it's okay. I know even rereading your book is really like, man, this is really good. Lord, I just pray that, God uses it to, reach so many people that are longing for what to do, having healthy relationships with their children. Maybe this is a good starter to read it and bring up some things, even if just little casual things, asking how they're doing. Because you as parents know your children probably better than they know themselves sometimes. To be able to give them that safe space to talk and so they can come to you and, when they're down, and so they don't carry these things and these burdens. I was a volunteer for, I don't know if you've ever heard of Atlanta Dream Center, and it's a Christian organization, and they had a slogan, and I wish I had remembered the exact thing, but it says that if you get to the children, they'll be healthier adults. And so my prayer in my heart, like yours, is let's get healthy children. Let's address those situations where children can be children, but also when they go through tough times, to be able to work through and process and to be healthy children as they get older, and knowing how to deal with stress, how to deal with discouragement, how to deal with grief, like you had brought up here, that it's not just losing a loved one, it's also losing relationships and, moving and things that are familiar. So I really love that. That's really great. In the back of your book, you do have some resources, which I think are really great. And you want to share just a little bit about those resources or any additional resources you might have for people who conversations with children?
Sure. Yes. I think it's probably the teacher in me. All of my children's books, I always go beyond the story, and I always want it to have some type of life application, educational side about it. And this one in particular, I couldn't help but start the story with a letter to the parents.
Yeah, that's good.
And I do encourage parents to read that, or caregivers, whoever's going to, read the book with the child, just to kind of know what inspired the story, where it came from, and how it is to be used kind of from the beginning. And it's very much just kind of my own journey, some of what you've already heard here. But in the back then, because, it's one thing to have a story, but it's then how can I use the story in a really practical way?
Right.
And already in the story itself, there is a prayer that's incorporated. When Pierre's tower that is very high and heavy, when it eventually just topples over, and the scene, probably one of my favorite scenes in the book, is where he is, just sitting on the floor amongst the rubble. He's sitting among the rocks, and that's when his parents come, because they hear the tower tumbling, and then they come to help, and they lead him in a prayer. So already in the story, there is a prayer that is part of the story. So it can be kind of an easy starter. But then I actually went into conversation starters in the back of the book that can be adapted to the child's age. Again, one thing we always do. In fact, I recently went to Morocco just after the earthquake, so that was back in October of last year, and I was doing trauma debriefing with children, and we were using this book, and we were using, you can buy like stackable rocks. They're super cool. You can find them. We've used Legos, we've used marshmallows. I've gone out into my garden and just found some rocks. Whatever you can find, you could use cereal or whatever, but make it be something that can be stacked. But, just to use kind of a kinesthetic, just a hands-on, something that they can touch and they can manipulate and work with as they're sharing their stories is really helpful. So I talk about some of those things, in the resources in the back, just what you can use, how to get those conversations started, and then actual questions that you can literally just read if you don't know where to begin. You can just read those questions and kind of fill in the blanks based on your child, their age, and what the situation is. And then Lauren Wells also does a guided prayer, so that's a part of the resources as well. We included an emotional feeling chart because some kids, like adults, don't know how to name our emotions, right? And so what's great for kids is that you can have these face charts where literally even a very young child who doesn't yet have the vocabulary for emotions can just point to the face that represents how they feel inside, and that can get the conversation started. So I hope those are helpful. And of course, Lauren Wells, all of her books on the grief tower, again, even though they were originally written with third culture kids in mind, the concepts and the learning and the application cross over to all grief in general, no matter where you're from or where you live or what your situation is, because it is unfortunately a universal story that we all share grief and loss.
Yeah, and in the U.S., because many people are moving around, this is really good for that conversation. When people move from another state to another part of the state, whatever, whenever there's change, any kind of change, I think it's wonderful.
Yes, you're right, Joy. It just brought something to mind. It kind of made me chuckle, but I was surprised when I saw that my book, again, I was thinking grief. I was thinking, that kind of loss that might be more in the area of processing, maybe death and dying and those kinds of things. But I saw that it was in the category of moving, and that was where a lot of my book sales and things like that were coming in that category. And I found it so interesting. And I think you've hit on a really big thing. If we look at our world right now, it's so transient and so mobile. Yeah. And we've got to be able to process with our kids, adults as well, but kids when they are, leaving behind their best friends and the home and bedroom that they've grown up in. And those are things that can really accumulate and wreak havoc later in our adult years if we don't process them well.
Yeah, well said. So are you going to be doing another sequel to this or an additional book, or what does the future look for you, Marcy, for book writing?
Okay, well, I've always got lots of books in process. I joke that, I have about 10 more books half written, and maybe they'll
understand that.
finish one day, or maybe they won't. But yes, I do like to tackle hard topics, whether it be for adults or whether it be for kids. I just published actually a few months ago. My newest book is called Icky Itchy Underwear, and it's a fun story for overcoming challenging things in life for kids. So it's tackling actually sensory issues that can be, whether it be clothing, textiles, food, food textures, things like that. But this idea that we all experience things that are difficult for us and that we don't want to do, but that we have to do. And for the character in the book, Pierre, he does not like to wear underwear, but discovers it's something that he just has to do because everyone everywhere in the world wears underwear. And so there are tools and things in the story where Pierre learns how to overcome the challenge of wearing underwear and getting over that. And so I love to tackle difficult issues. I kind of dive into pain and grief. I'm one that doesn't kind of skirt around it. The hard topics are those. I'm very direct in discussions and conversations. So I do that in my writing as well. And one topic that I hope to address in the future is even for children, and I know, Joy, that you're looking at that possibility too, is how to talk about difficult topics such as suicide with children. It's something that's we're hearing more and more about in our society. Our family has recently been hit head on with that particular type of grief, and it's one that I've never known before. So I hope to write a book for adults and perhaps a children's book at some point as well. But so those are a few things on the horizon, as well as thinking about grief. Another one that's in process is pet loss. We lost. That's a grief that a lot of us around the world share. We've lost a pet who is like a child or a brother or sister, like a family member to us. And our family just last year lost Sammy. He was our dog of 16 years. He traveled around the world with us. He was the dog in the suitcase. So I'm writing a memoir about our family's journey with him around the world. But I also would love to write a children's book about the dog in the suitcase and just how to process that grief of pet loss.
That's good, because there's a lot of people I know recently, even at our church, that have called in wanting somebody to really spend time with them when they've lost a pet as well. I know it's a different kind of grief, and we can't say one grief is less than the other, right? It's how a person processes and how important that was to them. So I look forward to those. And
yes, well, I hope they'll be finished one day.
Yeah, well, I understand that.
Yes, I know you do.
When the right time comes, it will happen, is what I say.
That's right.
Well, Marcy, this has been really a great conversation with you. I really, once again, love your book, and I hope that many, many people will read it and buy it for others. My Tower is Tumbling by Marcy Renee. It's going to be available on our site as well for people who want to purchase that, but also to visit her own site. We'll have it up there as well on our site so that you can go look at all of the books she's done and future things that she is going to be having available. So Marcy, thank you again. This has been a great conversation. We're praying for you and real excited to see how God's going to continue to use you in your giftings, in your writing, and also your ministry that you're in. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Joy, for the invitation and just the conversation. Thank you so much.
It's been great.
Thank you for listening. For more information, visit www.suicideloss.org. That's suicideloss.org. This presentation was not intended as a substitute for professional care. Please see a counselor or physician for your individual needs. Subscribe and like so that you never miss an episode.